Hey everybody, good morning. How are you today? So we're going to be moving into our new chapter, which is going to be our unit on World War II, and this is going to be our biggest unit that we do all year. You'll see that as we go through chapter 13 and 14, there's going to be a lot of information to discuss about what led to the war, who were the key people, what were the major battles, how the U.S. finally got involved, how it impacted Americans at home, what led to the resolution of the war in Europe and in Asia, and finally, how did World War II come to an end and what was the lasting impact in the US? So this will be one of our biggest units of the year. And as we go into fourth quarter, you'll see just like the other quarters, we're just going to do two big units, one on World War II and one on kind of modern America post-World War II. So we're starting off today just looking at the rise of dictatorships in chapter 13, section 1. And so in this first section, we're going to be in this first section all of this week and then probably a little bit into next week. We're going to be looking at what was happening in Europe to lead to World War II. So what was the political climate like after World War I? How did the Great Depression, impact these countries? And what changes were happening in society? So always looking at the political, economic, and social factors that lead us to the war. And then eventually kind of who are these dictators who come to power? What choices do they make that lead them to war? So the first thing just to mention is, you have to understand that in the years after World War I, most Americans really believe in isolationism. So in the 1920s, when our soldiers come home, Americans are very upset that 116,000 Americans died, most of them dying more so from infection and from the Spanish flu, really from fighting in combat. But we vowed to not get involved in another war. So remember, we never joined the League of Nations. We basically say that we're going to just do our own thing from here on out. So in the 1920s, Americans were all about isolationism. We never really kind of got involved in what was happening in world affairs. And the problem was that these countries were really struggling economically. They were never really able to rebuild. Germany was struggling the most because, remember, part of the Treaty of Versailles stated that Germany was to blame for World War I and that they were supposed to pay for all of World War I, $33 billion in reparations. And they just didn't have that kind of money. And Germany went bankrupt. And so we came up with this crazy plan to try to assist the situation. We wanted to see these countries get back on their feet. It was in our best interest because if they were economically stable, they would buy American products. And so we gave a loan to Germany called the Dawes Plan so they could repay some of their loans to Britain and France. And then Britain and France used that money to repay some of the loans they had taken out to us. It was ridiculous. We basically got repaid with our own money. But it did get some of the money flowing in those countries, but it wasn't enough to really help these people. They were still struggling economically, they were struggling psychologically, they were depressed about the lost generation. And without the United States in the League of Nations to really give it some backup, some force, it was just an empty organization where they met and they said, yes, war is bad. And no one really tested that assertion that war was bad, war is evil in the 20s. But it really created this climate where dictators, individuals could come to power, where they could, play on people's fears of, hey, this is never going to get better. Your family's going to starve. They're going to struggle. Unless you do what I say, I've got this great plan to fix our country, to get us back on track, to make us a world power, to put food on your table. You should listen to me and give up all your rights. And that's exactly what happened in Germany, in Italy, in Russia, which is going by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR at this point, as they are a communist-led nation. Remember, they had that communist revolution at the end of World War I. That's why they left the war early. And Japan. I've just got a chart just to remind you kind of the deaths from World War I. We already kind of mentioned that. That's going to have a huge, staggering psychological effect on people. And then, of course, I already mentioned, the ineffectiveness of the League of Nations, that, without the United States joining it, it really doesn't have any ability to, kind of control major conflicts, or it doesn't have an effective military force. So even though in the 20s, nobody's really pushing the envelope. Nobody's really kind of trying to attack someone else and conquer them. But if they had, the League of Nations was just an empty group. They had really no ability to stop them, since they didn't have a military force, and they really couldn't control any major conflicts or really kind of deal with any disagreements. At the end of the 20s, the United States joined an organization where it was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, where 32 countries from around the world came together and they said, we all agree that war is bad and we shouldn't be attacking anyone else. Most countries at this point had disarmed themselves. They had destroyed many of their battleships. They had done that after meeting in Washington in the early 20s, the Washington Naval Conference. But yet again, these are just all in the facade. Japan was one of those countries which even joined this Kellogg-Briand Pact, where they agreed that war is bad, yet at the same time, behind the scenes, they were building up their military. So a country can do one thing, or say one thing, but actually do another. And so the world was really kind of on this teetering point where everything, yet again, looked from the image like everything was fine and we were recovering. But it was a very, breakable kind of piece. And it was just on the surface that everything really looked safe and fine. And so when the stock market crashes in 1929, it has a worldwide effect because the United States, remember, had been loaning money to people like Germany so they could repay their loans to Britain and France. When the stock market crashes in the US, we're not going to be in the position where we can loan money to Germany and then they can't repay their loans to Britain and France. We also see that, of course, in the United States, we had investors from around the world. This is kind of a global stock market at this point early on. And so Britain and France and many of these other countries in Europe, they lose money when our market crashes as well. When the Americans end up in a depression and they're not able to buy foreign goods, it has a huge impact because those countries lose money and then, their economy slowly but surely turns into a depression as well as these worldwide fears kind of swept the planet that, what was going to happen? How was our economy going to improve? How are we going to really kind of get on the right track again? And so we weren't buying their goods and their economy just kind of goes into a depression as well. Remember, we didn't make the situation any better by passing that Hawley-Smoot tariff, where we're engaging in a trade war. We're refusing to really buy foreign goods by putting up a tariff on them. So they respond by putting up a tariff on American-made goods. So what we're getting at is that because of all of these factors coming together, it's really created this breeding ground for dictators. And we already kind of talked about some of these other points here. So I've got the most important ones you really want to put down in your notes, remember, in bold. And then these will always eventually be placed under classwork as well, so you can find the notes there. And so because of, this kind of, they never really kind of recovered after World War I during the 1920s. Their economies were already slow. And then you combine that with the Great Depression. Now people are out of work. They're struggling. Food is scarce. They've lost all hope. They, have all these fears. And so it makes it possible for the creation of these totalitarian states, a country that is run by one person, an authoritative leader, a dictator, and how they choose to really kind of rule the country is kind of up to them. Will it be in kind of more of a military style? Will they believe that people should put their needs above all others? So we'll kind of mention that here in a minute. So when it comes to this totalitarian state, okay, a totalitarian state is when you're creating a society where you have one ruler, a dictator. A dictator is someone who has come to power through force. We're talking about a government structure, the people who are in charge, who are making the decisions, that is, very authoritative, where you've got one person who is this authoritarian leader who is making all the decisions. The people have very limited autonomy or choices. It is not a democracy like we have, where you choose your leaders. When you have, one person in power and you've got a very, authoritarian system, Did they come to power because they're next in line to inherit a throne, like a monarchy? That's obviously, one scenario, but that's not what's happening in these countries. These are people who've come to power through force. Um, they perhaps instill fear in others, so people allow them to come to power, or they have conned the people. They've manipulated and persuaded people that they are someone that they are not. They've created this false facade so that people believe that they're the best choice. And perhaps there's some kind of vote, but they have, you know, really manipulated people into believing that they should vote for them. So when it comes to these totalitarian states, who we're focusing on here in section 1 is we're talking about Benito Mussolini. He is going to take power in Italy, and he's going to create what's called a fascist state, or fascism. If you are a fascist leader, you are putting the needs of the country above your own personal needs. Of course, Adolf Hitler comes to power in Germany, and all 4 of these men, remember, are dictators, and they're ruling with complete authority over the people, and they have really used some kind of violent method or fear tactic to take power. Adolf Hitler, though, more so than Benito Mussolini, really relies on charm and manipulation and persuasion to come to power. And his political party is called Nazism. So we've got Mussolini with fascism, Hitler with Nazism, and yet again, Nazism, it's similar in some ways to fascism because it is about putting the needs of the country above your own. But he also talks about the needs of the party, and he talks about the racial ethnic superiority. And we'll talk more about the differences when we get to each of these individual men. Then we've got Hideki Tojo in Japan, who is a military leader. And he, yet again, their focus is, as he comes to power and uses the military to support his kind of rise to power over the emperor and over any legitimate member of government. It's not just about him, it's about the military and the government in general that people kind of put their allegiance and respect to. But they still believe that Japan is superior and people should sacrifice, their own personal needs and interests for the Japanese people. And last but not least, we've got Joseph Stalin. He's going to be the leader of the Soviet Union, and he is a communist supporter. So when it comes to communism is the opposite, really, of Nazism. We're going to see that that's one of the ways that Hitler and Stalin do not get along. They have very different views. All these views are really about one person who's in power, who, controls all aspects of life. But when it comes to communism, it's this sense of solidarity and shared societies working towards the benefit of all. Whereas, Nazism and fascism believe that one party is more important, but it's not about treating everyone equally by any means. Fascists and Nazis tend to look down on the Soviet Union. So as I keep saying, a totalitarian state is a word that you should be familiar with, and it has that word total in there. So we're talking about total control, total power. And so when we talk about, each of these men, whether it's Stalin or Mussolini or Hideki Tojo or Adolf Hitler, they definitely are creating, a society where they have total control over people's lives. And in general, when it comes to totalitarianism, it has 4 different features. That's how you know that it's a totalitarian state. The 2 that are in bold are the most important ones for you really to know. And the first one is, as I've been talking about, you have this very authoritarian, autocratic leader who does not give the people any autonomy or self-control. He's come to power through force. He usually has military backing. He is a dictator. And many people in that society will treat him like a god. He has total unquestioned authority. The people have very few individual rights. And, whatever this person says goes. People are fearful of this person. Perhaps they like them in the beginning because this person is offering something. And these 4 men, especially as the 20s come to an end, the 30s begin, they're going to be able to offer the people in their country hope, a new life after World War I and after the Great Depression, economic stability, And so people like them, especially in the beginning. And then over time, once they see their true facade cracking and that they're violent men, they're afraid to cross them. They're afraid to die because they see that others are who stand up for their beliefs. And so then they continue to follow in these measures. And there's other people who have twisted themselves into thinking that these people are legitimate leaders and that they should be followed. The thing about these societies is there's only one political party, and that is the political party of this dictator, of this totalitarian leader. So when we look at Italy, everybody has to be fascist. In Germany, everybody has to be a member of the Nazi party. So even if you have different political views, those political views pretty much have to be put to the side. If you want to have any kind of economic, social success, if you want to fit in, you have to at least pretend that you are a member of this mainstream party. And, in the beginning, most of these leaders use charm and manipulation, persuasion, plus perhaps they do have a few good policies. That's how they get people on board to begin with. But over time, as people try to question their authority and they miss free speech and free press and other rights that they used to have, a secret police is put in place to terrorize the people, to control the populace. And these people are incredibly brutal and violent, and they will do whatever it takes to silence the opposition, to take out political rivals, to ensure that they are still in power. And of course, it's going to be these violent tendencies where they rule their own country, and they have these visions of grandeur, which led us to World War II because they believed they should be allowed to take over the rest of the world and spread their excellent regime. So today our focus really is just on Japan. And in Japan, we're not going to talk about Japan's true rise of power, but Japan isn't a country that we've really focused on too much so far this year. The first time we really mentioned them was in the 1850s. You had Commodore Matthew Perry leave the United States, and he tried to really kind of create an open trade relationship between Japan and the U.S. and the Western nations. Japan, after that point, started to go through the Second Industrial Revolution. They started to modernize. They started to industrialize. They started selling goods throughout Asia, and China was clearly the weaker nation at this point. They'd opened themselves up to foreign influence, and China was busy trying to fight off the British during that Opium War. And then, of course, remember the U.S. finally had to step in with that open door policy to make sure that, China was not completely conquered by other nations. But China was really kind of constantly struggling in terms of what would be its next step. It once was a great nation in terms of power and wealth, but it was struggling at this point. Japan, on the other hand, was a very traditional society, right, where we still saw that they had land-owning nobles, and they kind of passed on land from one generation to the next. They were really the wealthy elite. We still see that for many years they had, a kind of a samurai system who followed a code of Bushido or chivalry, where they respected their elders, they pledged allegiance to the society, they would do whatever it took. But it was a society that was based on honor and passing down traditions, respecting your elders, living one, kind of aligned with nature and with different spirits of nature. And for a long time, they did not want to kind of get involved with the rest of the world, so they keep their traditions to themselves. We see that Japan started to kind of come on the world stage more in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They almost went to war with Russia, but war was avoided when Teddy Roosevelt avoided war between those two countries. He was kind of the peacemaker there. He eventually got a Nobel Peace Prize for doing this. And then Japan did play a minor role in World War I, assisting the Allied powers, kind of just getting their feet wet. What you see on the right there is Emperor Hirohito. He is technically the emperor, the king of Japan. It's a very, prestigious position. But the way that the government is designed is that even though he rules, it's more like modern-day Great Britain, where you have a king or queen, but they are still sharing power with some elected leaders. He was the emperor, but he didn't really have any true power. He was supposed to be sharing power with others. After World War I, Japan is very angry because they felt like they did contribute to the war. They weren't awarded enough land and money and privileges from the peace treaty. They didn't get enough worldwide recognition. And they were, very disappointed about this. They were kind of vengeful towards the Allied powers, towards Britain and France. That kind of sets up the animosity between these two countries. That's why they're on different sides in World War II. Especially during the 20s, Japan is, they don't have huge losses from World War I, but they did, have some costs, some expenditures. And more so than ever before, the Japanese wholeheartedly believed that they were the superior Asian race. So there is a racial element going in here. And they believed that they should be expanding into Asia. They wanted to conquer other lands so they could gain more raw materials, gain more farmland, support their growing population. And of course, you can't do that if you're, an island nation. They have to actually physically conquer and take over others if they truly want to expand. They at least wanted to create a sphere of influence where they could influence trade throughout Asia and, kind of create exclusive trade deals with those countries so that they would reap the benefits from trade. They didn't want to see European powers controlling trade in Vietnam and some of these other countries, including, the U.S. is, influencing trade since we control the Philippines at this point. The Japanese don't like the European influence and what they see as their portion of the world. And at this point, what we're going to see happen is that Hideki Tojo, who, married in the early 1900s, served in World War I, continued to rise in the ranks. After World War I, we get into the 1920s. He continually is, going up the ranks in terms of the military. He is promoted to colonel. And eventually we're going to see that people start to really support a transfer of power. And they really support the idea that Emperor Hirohito is not a true leader. We don't want to elect any leaders. We want to create a society where the military controls things. The military knows best. We're doing this in terms of what will be best for the Japanese people. And what we really need is to expand, to really kind of have a society that supports militarism so that we can conquer others and gain more land and money and power. Hideki Tojo has proved himself to be a great commander. And so if you want to be, someone who truly supports Japanese culture and society, you should support Hideki Tojo's rise in rank. And eventually he is promoted to prime minister. And so he's going to be kind of the one who's truly calling the shots. And he's going to be the one that creates this totalitarian state. Emperor Hirohito has no real choice but to go along with things unless he wants to die. So he pretty much just kind of shrinks off into the background as technically a monarch with very little power. And this was kind of the norm at this point in history. You're almost done here. We've got 2 slides. So things only kind of get worse for Japan. And Hideki Tojo really and truly isn't in power into the early 1930s. There's still he's rising up through the ranks, but, we still see some other elected leaders at this point, and Emperor Hirohito still has more power, so it's not really going to be that true transition as the early 1930s. And part of the reason what really kind of, pushes people to make Hideki Tojo a dictator is the fact that the Great Depression occurs. Because if you watch this YouTube link, we'll watch part of it in class, they talk a lot about how the Great Depression really hit Japan hard because Japan made a lot of its money by exporting silk. It was one of its luxury goods. Well, as you can imagine, since the United States and all these European countries are going through a worldwide depression, they don't have the money to buy silk pajamas and, silk sheets and silk fancy satin dresses and such. So they're not able to export their main good. They're not making really any money, and they're struggling kind of economically, especially because their country was building all of these military weapons so that they could perhaps, obtain this plan for global domination. At first, it was really just focused on Asia, right? But they need money desperately. And so what they basically decide is that's kind of what pushes them to officially put Hideki Tojo in power, create this totalitarian state, focus on militarism, that him and the military know what's best. They're going to purposely conquer other countries and basically steal their resources, enslave those people in a sense, and that's how they're going to make their money. Now, Japan at this point has already enslaved, so to speak, Korea. Japan has taken over. It wasn't North versus South Korea. It was just the entire Korean peninsula. They've already taken them over. They've forced those people to farm the land and basically feed the Japanese populace with the food that's coming from Korea. They've also been taking any natural resources like coal and such from Korea to heat their homes in Japan. So they were already kind of starting this, and now they're thinking about expanding this further. They want to take total control here of the Pacific. And so, of course, who's standing in their way, though, is China, because China is the biggest nation, considered the most powerful nation. But as I said, China's been going through all of these problems for years, going back to the mid-1800s, as they've been almost conquered by foreign powers, had internal power struggles over who should lead China next. And so, last slide here, what we're going to see happen is that, China really will not be in a position to fight back. So what Japan decides to do is they decide to attack Manchuria, which, as you see on the map there, it's Manchukuo. It was owned by China. It was full of natural resources, specifically coal and oil, and you're going to need a lot of oil if you're thinking about going to war, because they're already building their own tanks, their planes, guns, and preparing an army, because they would like to conquer all of China, or at least force China to create a sphere of influence with them where they have exclusive trade rights. China is not going to make them their own exclusive trade partner unless they're truly able to conquer China. And you're talking about a little island nation which already has taken over Korea, and they want to conquer all of China. It's a crazy plan. Obviously, there's more Chinese people than Japanese people, but if you have the technology, if you have the willpower, if you have the battle strategies, anything is possible. And so if you watch that video clip, they'll talk more about this, but basically Japan makes it look like the people of Manchuria attacked on the Manchuria-Korea border, and that some Japanese soldiers had died, and so that they have every right to invade Manchuria to defend the honor of those slain soldiers. But that was all a setup. We find out later that basically Japan was behind this bombings going off, and it was all a setup to really kind of just infuriate, the people of Manchuria, and to make it look like that they were, not attacking first, but they were just simply responding to an attack on their own men. But they're truly drawing first blood here. And of course, they're easily able to attack Manchuria, to seize it, and to conquer it, and then to add it to Korea. China is only able to sit and watch unless they really wanted to fight back. China should have fought back at this point. If they would have had, one, response where they came together, they could have perhaps stopped Japan and showed them that they were a worthy aggressor and that they were not going to, stand for such treatment. The reason China does not is because China is already in the midst of a civil war. Some of the people in China want to become communist. Some of the people want to continue being nationalist. And they're being heavily influenced by the USSR, by Russia to their north. And so that's why China is not really able to fight back. Now, the rest of the world also just kind of sits by and listens and kind of watches. Remember, Japan is part of that Kellogg-Briand Pact, where they said that war is morally wrong, and yet the United States, all of their countries, do nothing as Japan goes about attacking. We just pretty much let it happen. And so what we see happen is that once Japan gains Manchuria, Hideki Tojo's kind of popularity in Japan increases because people realize, wow, he is a good leader. He's getting us more resources. He's getting us more money. And of course, once you get more resources like oil and coal, it's going to then need to be processed, and it's going to create more jobs at home. They're going to be able to sell this because you're stealing the resource. You can sell it and make money, and then you can use that money to, create more jobs in your home country. Plus, they're getting ready for a war. And so as an economy goes into war production, more jobs are created. Now, of course, there were people who disliked him, who spoke out against him, but he silences his critics, and he focuses on educating the next generation, the Japanese youth. And he starts to really kind of create a closer relationship with Germany, creating the Anti-Comintern Pact, which basically said, we're going to be buddies, we're going to respect each other, and Japan is going to focus on conquering Asia, and Germany will focus on conquering Europe. But of course, the details of these pacts were not truly public. And then, finally, in 1937, Japan does attack China, and it will spend all of World War II trying to attack China as well as all of Asia to create this empire. So that's kind of how Hideki Tojo comes to power. Have a great day, guys. We'll talk about the other leaders later this week.